evening, ladies and gentlemen, members of the public, members of the committee, and welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee for BCP Council. I'll hand over to Mrs. Tompkins from Democratic Services for the introduction to the meeting and for the first three items. Mrs. Tompkins.
Many thanks, Chairman. If I can take the opportunity to read out the housekeeping notice. Please note that this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee is being recorded by the Council for live broadcast and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. Please could everyone present follow these ground rules. Only speak when invited to by the Chairman. If accessing via Teams, always turn on your video function when invited to speak and state your name. Please use your microphones when speaking and please mute or turn off your microphone when you are not talking. If accessing via Teams and would like to speak on an item, please do so by utilising the raise your hand feature in the bar at the top of the Teams window. If a vote is required, when the Democratic Services Officer will call out each committee member's name in turn, starting with the Chairman and Vice Chairman, please respond with for, against or abstain. For those in the room, please note that if the fire alarm sounds, please exit the building by way of the nearest available signed fire exit route and make your way to the ground floor of the multi-storey car park. Finally, please ensure background noise is kept to a minimum and mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you. Chairman, as requested, if I can move members to the first item on the agenda, which is apologies. I can report that we've received apologies from Councillor Anne Filer. I'm not aware of any other apologies, and I think other than that, we're a full complement. So item 2, which is substitute members. I've not been notified of any substitute members for this meeting. Moving to item 3, declarations of interest. Can I ask members of council that are here tonight to make any declarations of disclosable pecuniary interests or equally any local interests on any items on the agenda?
Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. It's for agenda item 7. I think in paragraph 28 it makes reference to Bournemouth Development Company, of which I am council appointee to the board.
Are there any others? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Tompkins. I should perhaps add that I discussed with Councillor Anne Filer her absence at the meeting this evening. She is self-isolating, although she hasn't been pinged and is by close contact with somebody who believes that they might have COVID. So she's done the right thing by all of us, but it was too late for us to find a substitute. So I'm grateful for her for being so honest about it. Item 4 on the agenda is the confirmation of minutes. Are you agreed that the minutes that have been circulated of the meeting held on the 10th of June 2021 are a complete and accurate record of that meeting? Is that agreed? Thank you very much indeed. Item 5, public issues. Mrs. Tompkins.
Chairman, thank you. I can report that no public issues have been received for this meeting. Thank you.
So that takes us on to the first substantive item, which is item 6 on the agenda, financial statements 2020-21, informing the risk assessment and review of significant judgments and sources of estimation uncertainty. And this item is going to be taken tonight by Matthew Filmer, who is the interim appointment for Dan Povey, who's left the authority, and I believe that Nicola Webb is available if there are any questions which Mr. Filmer feels should be handed to her. So without further ado, over to you, Mr. Filmer.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a new report coming to Audit and Governance Committee tonight, and it's likely to become an annual report in advance of the signing off of the audited financial statements. So each year, the external auditors are required, as part of their risk assessment and as part of their audit planning, to make inquiries to understand how those charged with governance, this committee, exercise oversight of management processes that officers follow. So Appendix A to this report sets out a list of questions that the auditors have asked of officers, which cover a number of key areas such as fraud and accounting estimates, and management have provided responses to those questions. And the intention of this report is to give the committee an opportunity to confirm their understanding and agreement with those responses. So I don't intend to go through the detail of Appendix A because it's quite a lengthy document, but just to cover some of the key areas in which it covers. So it covers fraud. So there's a series of questions that tries to understand the council's internal controls in terms of how we prevent and detect fraud, how we have internal policies and controls, and how instances of fraud are communicated to this committee. It asks a series of questions in regards to laws and regulations and how the council complies with those laws and regulations. And a good example of one of the responses is that for all council and cabinet reports, we have the monitoring officer which signs off those reports to confirm that they're in accordance with legislation. There are a series of questions in regards to related parties, and for those that are unfamiliar with that term, that is where there may be an arrangement between two parties that has a pre-existing relationship, so there may be a conflict of interest. And a good example of the controls that council has is the declaration of interest that all members and senior officers have to sign. And lastly, the auditors asked a series of questions in regards to the council's internal controls over accounting estimates. And this is the real catalyst in why we're bringing this report to the committee. The auditing standards have been significantly enhanced as a result of some of the public company failings that have been in the media. And so they boosted some of the audit standards around accounting estimates. Now, accounting estimates we make within the financial statement, and the reason why auditors are scrutinising these more is because they carry a level of risk. They carry a level of risk because sometimes the figures in the accounts are relied upon high levels of uncertainty, or that they require a significant level of judgment. So to help the committee understand some of those accounting estimates, Appendix B to this report sets out all the material accounting estimates that are within the financial statements. So again, I don't intend to go through all those in detail because there is a lot there. The big material accounting estimates that we make as part of our financial statements are the valuation of plant, property and equipment. So that's our sort of buildings and vehicles. And the type of internal controls that the council has in regards to reducing the risk over some of those estimates is that we procure valuation from external professionals, RICS qualified valuers. We have internal policies about how regularly we value assets and making sure that they're kept up to date. I do just want to note to the committee that on page 57 of the pack, it makes reference to COVID and the uncertainty that that causes in regards to valuation of property. We've since confirmed that's no longer relevant. It was something we put in our draft accounts, but we've since learned from the valuers that that's not applicable in terms of valuations. I just want to make that clear with members that that sentence should have been removed. So I'll stop there and I'll happily take any questions on the report.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Filmer. Members, do you have any questions? Nobody has indicated that they have, so I'll move straight to the recommendations, and there are two, and they are, which I will take together. The first is to approve the responses provided by management to the external auditors as set out in Appendix A, and secondly, to approve the approach to accounting estimates in the financial statements as set out in Appendix B. Members, can we agree those recommendations? Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Mrs. Tompkins. That takes us on to item 7 on the agenda, which is the Treasury Management monitoring outturn for 2021 and an update for Q1 of 21-22. And that is for you again, Mr. Filmer, to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. So with all Treasury Management Update reports, I'll start with a very brief economic update, and hopefully everyone's still aware that interest rates remain historically low at 0.1%. And you'll see in table 1 of the report, the Council's Treasury Management Consultants, Link Asset Services, do not expect an interest rate rise until the late 2023, so quite a long time off. However, inflation is the big topic in terms of the global economies at the moment and the risks that potentially will cause. So the UK rate of inflation as at the end of June, the CPI rate was 2.5%, and the Bank of England's target for inflation that it tries and maintains is 2%. So it's causing a bit of a split in terms of the view of that inflation. Some are viewing those figures as a temporary peak because of the unlocking of COVID measures and the economy opening up. However, some are seeing it as a more ingrained inflation, and that's where it becomes a risk, particularly for council services, because it will carry on increasing costs. And what we may see is the Bank of England starting to increase interest rates sooner, because that's their control over inflation. So moving on to the actual Treasury Management outturn for 2021. Table 2 sets out the overall performance of the function, which was an 18,000 unspent. And this is mainly due to the council having received significant cash balances from government in terms of government support, but equally where we were distributing business grants. And that just meant our cash balances were a lot higher, and it meant that we didn't need to do any temporary borrowing as we originally thought coming into this into 2021. Table 3 shows that borrowing as of the end of March was just over 194 million, and Table 4 shows that we closed the year with investments at just over 56 million. So moving on to Q1 for 21-22, you'll see in Table 5 we're currently assuming quite a significant underspend of 171,000, and that is again down to the same reason that we still are sat on quite significant government funding. That some of it will need to be repaid, but because of that, it's reducing our need to temporarily borrow for cash flow purposes. Table 6 shows total borrowing at 208 million, and this now includes a new loan that the council's taken on, which was for 49 million from Phoenix Life, which is a front for a pension fund. And this was a loan that was agreed 3 years ago at Legacy Bournemouth Borough Council. We agreed the rate 3 years ago. It was fixed interest rate at that time, but we drew the money down in May this year. So that's the 49 million addition. And Table 7 shows that investments at the end of June stood at just over 98 million. And to confirm to the committee that throughout 2021 and the first quarter, all prudential indicators and the Treasury Management Strategy was fully complied with. So moving on to paragraph 23 of the report, this provides an update in regards to borrowing. Now, some committee members may remember at the beginning of this year when I presented the Treasury Management Strategy for 21-22, I gave them an update in terms of refinancing of the capital programme, where we looked to switch funding from reserves and revenue and switch that funding to prudential borrowing. And that was agreed, and that increase in borrowing was fed into the Treasury Management Strategy 21-22. Since agreeing that strategy, the Council has continued to explore its ambition to invest in the conurbation, and this has been expressed as part of the big plan, which will see significant investment in housing, infrastructure, regeneration, and predominantly that will need to be funded from borrowing. But it's equally important to say that we will also own a greater number of assets through that increase in debt. So in order for the Treasury Management function to support this agenda, we've challenged ourselves in finance to look at where we are in terms of our current debt position and how that compares against other upper tier authorities. And that's what Appendix 1 of this report sets out, and it shows that across the spectrum of all upper tier authorities, which includes all unitaries, counties, Mets. But BCP Council is at the lower end of the spectrum in terms of total debt, but also total debt as a proportion of the net budget. And so, as I said, we challenged ourselves to make sure that we came up with a way that we could increase the headroom on debt, but equally ensure that it was prudent, that it's affordable, and that it follows the Prudential Code of Practice that we have to follow in terms of carrying out borrowing. So what we decided to do was take the middle point of all that spectrum of upper tier authorities. So we didn't look at the upper quartile or even the second quartile, the middle point of that spectrum of authorities. And what that equated to, and that's shown on the second page of the appendix, is that we could increase our debt limit by another 212 million. Just to be clear, it's a debt limit. This isn't us taking on more borrowing. It just provides the capacity to do that. So table 8 of the report reflects that increase in the debt indicators. And what we're seeking from the committee tonight is approval of those revised debt indicators to make sure they're aware and confident of what I've just set out, and that we recommend that to full council. So I'll happily take any questions on the report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Filmer. That was comprehensive. Members, do you have any questions? Councillor Phipps.
Apologies, it just all disappeared off my screen and I'm going to have to bring it back up again, but I'll just do it for memory. Appendix 1, it was a bit, I was trying to enlarge it on the screen. It's somewhat difficult to see, but I got the gist of it from everything you said. This extra debt, do we have any sort of time scale as to when we might actually repay the debt? I mean, we had a debt and now we're increasing it even more. I understand there may be assets available, but debts do need to be repaid. How is that kind of working out? Could you just give a bit of an explanation, please? Thank you.
Through you, Chair. So in terms of the debt repayment, it does depend on the asset that we're purchasing or that we're constructing. So if it was a building, say, we would tend to repay that debt over 50 years. If it was a purchase of a vehicle, that tends to have a useful life of 7 to sort of 10 years. So we'd look to repay the debt in that space of time as well. So it does depend on the nature of what we're doing.
Would you like to come back?
It could be up to 50 years, so it's depends on what the debt is for.
Yes, yeah, and 50 years is the maximum. We can't go beyond that.
Okay, but you presumably would hope it wouldn't take that long. Or some of it might then. So we just don't know, basically.
We don't know, but we have to set aside money in the revenue budget to pay off that debt. And although we have a set minimum criteria for that, we could at points overpay and we could bring that debt down quicker. So we do have that choice.
Councillor Trent.
Yeah, one sort of query I've got on debt. Why have we taken on a debt that was set up by a predecessor council? That, to me, that doesn't seem quite right, because you know, it should be BCP deciding on what it takes on, not to sort of spring into life with a debt that dates back to before the formation of BCP Council. I wonder if someone can explain to me how that works.
Would you like to try and rehearse the history of where that came from, Mr. Filmer?
I can do, yeah. So in regards to the legacy councils, Christchurch had no debt. So when we started BCP and on its inception, we transferred no debt from Christchurch. Bournemouth and Poole, we did carry over a level of debt, but the majority of that was sat within the housing revenue account. And that dates back to 12-13, when we effectively brought the housing stock off the government. And to do that, we had to take out a level of borrowing. So that's what the majority of the Bournemouth Poole debt was in relation to. But equally, when we went through the disaggregation of services from Dorset County Council, we also took on an element of Dorset's debt, which was circa sort of 20 million. And that was again because we've also taken on assets that were under the county's control, and they're now part of BCP Council. Because that debt tends to be linked to assets, and those are those assets that are transferred into BCP cancel, that's why the debt has also followed.
Yes, so it is basically it's inherited debt rather than new debt that was agreed a few years ago.
Yes.
Yeah, right, thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, similar question following on from the previous one, actually, looking at that table 6 about council borrowings as at the 30th of June 2021, and the point you made about the additional £49 million borrowing that had been sort of drawn down, which was negotiated by the predecessor authority, Bournemouth Borough Council. Looking at the interest rates for those, that does, you know, it's a long-term borrowing, but it is at a lower rate than almost all of the others that we've got listed there. Could I just inquire, so it's with Phoenix Life Limited, what was that originally sort of negotiated for? What, in terms of Bournemouth Borough Council negotiating a £49 million loan a few years ago? And is there any scope? I know most of the other loans, sort of borrowings there, are listed as Public Works Loan Board, and they have varying number of years left to run. Is there any scope for early termination of other borrowings to sort of to switch them around? I guess we have early repayment penalties, those sorts of things, but is that looked at in terms of sort of cancelling other borrowings for sort of lower rate, longer term borrowing?
Mr. Filmer.
Thank you, Chair. So in regard to million, and this is quite a difficult concept that I struggle across the council to try and explain, but I'll try my best. When we take on debt, it doesn't necessarily mean it's linked to a purchase. So it is all down to cash flow, and in terms of when we need the money. So that £49 million, when we took it out, we knew that we would need cash around this sort of time. And so that's why we had that flexibility to draw it down in 3 years' time, because we knew through balance sheet projections that we would have a shortfall in cash this year. And that's how a lot of the borrowing tends to be driven by, is from a cash flow perspective rather than a link to an actual purchase of an asset, say. It might be that the point in time when we did it was linked, it happened to be that we purchased an asset at that point in time, but the two are two separate transactions. So that's the reason on the 49 million. In terms of the early repayment of the PWLB, because interest rates are so low at the moment, the early repayment charges on the PWLB are, they make no economic sense for us to repay them early. So we always review that and we make sure that's the case, because some of those interest rates are quite high. But at the moment, there's no economic sense to pay them early.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, thanks for that answer. Just I've got one other question, actually, if that's okay, but just to come back on that one, actually, it's my main inquiry was that the £49 million and the timing of it being around 2018 was around the time of the Mallard Road retail park purchase, and 49 million, I understand, was about the amount that was paid for that. So I just was inquiring really whether it was linked to that, and it's from the timing and the amount, it seems to me that it was linked in some way, but I accept the fact that, you know, it's only just been drawn down because it makes sense at that rate. The next table, table 7, the investment summary, looking at the sort of, obviously you're getting very little interest on any of our sort of cash holdings, fixed term deposits, call accounts, etc. But there are obviously, there's a lot of money in there, £98 million, which is, I know I get very little on my own account, but I don't have 98 million in it, so it doesn't really make much difference. But even 0.25% on those sorts of sums is pretty significant. Looking at that, we've got £37 million approximately in instant access accounts at 0.01%. If that was at 0.25%, my rough calculations, that's about £90,000 a year additional interest you would get. What traditionally, I accept the fact that, you know, there's a lot of cash flow in and out of accounts and holding, but what level do we tend to think we need to hold on instant access? Traditionally, is £37 million more than we would normally hold, or is it less, or how do we sort of manage knowing what we need to hold as instant access to draw on immediately?
Mr. Filmer.
Thank you, Chair. So in regards to the instant access, that is driven by our cash flow projections that we do on a daily basis for the rest of the financial year. So there is logic behind us keeping that amount in an instant access account for that period. It may be that the following day, bear in mind this was at the end of the month, that we then had to make a repayment for some of the debt, or it may be that we had a large creditors run the next day, and so that we needed to keep some of that cash instant so that we could then draw it down to pay off those liabilities. But with that cash flow projections, we always try and make sure that we don't, we always try and maximise the amount of interest rate that we can earn on that those investments. But obviously, we need to keep an element of it liquid as well. So there's a balance, and it's the cash flow projections are key in ensuring that.
Members, are there any other questions for Mr. Filmer? No. In that case, we have 4 recommendations. The first 3 are for noting, and I propose that we'll deal with those together, and then we'll come to the 4th one after that. So the 3 recommendations for noting are to note the reported activity of the Treasury Management Function for 2020-21, to note the reported activity of the Treasury Management Function for April to June 2021, and to note and endorse the update on borrowing set out from paragraphs 23 through to 29. So could we note those 3? And then moving to the 4th one, this is to approve and recommend to full council the revised prudential indicators set out in table 8 and the proposed adjustment to the council minimum revenue provision policy as set out in paragraph 32 and as explained by Mr. Filmer a few moments ago. All those in favour of that recommendation, please show. And are there any against? I take it, Councillor Trent, that you're abstaining. Thank you very much. So that 4th recommendation is agreed. Thank you very much, Mr. Filmer. I think I should say that as we go forward, one of the things I've been discussing with Mr. Richards, the Council's Chief Financial Officer, together with the leader of the council, is to get a good understanding of how these issues are being assessed and dealt with and taken forward. And the reason for me being there in those meetings is so that I can judge whether they are issues which this committee perhaps wants to do a bit more work on, or more importantly, perhaps when we reach certain stages in that process, do we want to find that they are brought to this committee so that the committee is not only aware but can ask relevant questions on them? That initiative, I think, was originally brought forward by Mr. Richards after a conversation I had with him. And I sense from some of the questions this evening that if and when we reach that point, that the committee will be quite keen to have that opportunity. And that being the case, that is what I shall do. And I shall bring that to the committee at an appropriate time. Perhaps, Mr. Filmer, in the absence of Mr. Richards this evening, you could just briefly explain that I set that out for the committee. Those meetings are going to be ongoing, just so that he is aware that the committee is now knows that is the process we're going to undertake.
Of course, yeah, good Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. So that takes us on to item 8 on the agenda, which is risk management, the corporate risk register update. I'm going to ask Fiona Manton to introduce the report and perhaps give us a brief update intertwined with that presentation on the risk workshop that we held recently. Ms. Manton.
Thank you, Chair. This is the quarterly update to the committee of the Council's Corporate Risk Register. Members will be aware of the continuing need to update and reflect the impact the pandemic has on the activities of the Council. And in relation to that, a full and comprehensive review of the corporate risks took place in June in advance of the workshop that we held in June. And from that, we asked some questions of each risk lead in determining whether the risk continued to be current still and whether the impacts of the pandemic were sufficiently considered in the context of each risk. The risk register that we've included in Appendix 1 of this report includes the updates that we've undertaken at the June review. So it considers the risks in both their usual context and the additional and evolving impacts the pandemic has. This states to embed the consideration of both as the Council continues to deliver its services within this environment. This report this quarter outlines the changes in risk during the quarter, and the detail in Appendix 1 provides the update, and the changes are dealt with in paragraphs 8 to 12 of the report. In terms of additions and deletions of risk this time, there aren't very many. The main risk change is the removal of corporate risk 8, which was the inability to run an election stroke referendum. Members will recall this is a risk which routinely escalates to the corporate risk register when elections are scheduled to take place. And then it's also de-escalated to a service level risk where it's routinely monitored when the elections have taken place. As mentioned, each of the risks has been reviewed, but if it wasn't possible to provide a detailed update when this report was prepared, this shouldn't give the committee cause for concern. Routinely, risks are reviewed with the Chief Executive every 6 weeks to consider all risks and prepare interim updates for consideration. When risk detail isn't provided on a small number of risks, that review and update provides assurance that reviews are continuing and the level of risk has not changed. For the committee's information, the next interim review is scheduled for early August. In paragraph 16 of the report, I would like to draw members' attention to the risk work we do, which continues on horizon scanning. We routinely look out for new legislation or any changes to the environment in which we operate, and we give advance notice to managers of information that they might find useful in either identifying or managing emerging risks. And we also challenge risks at both the corporate and service level to ensure that they're giving due consideration. Thank you for the opportunity to present my report. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Manton. Members, do you have any questions? Councillor Phipps.
Just to ask on CR11, ability of the council to function and operate efficiently as a single services across the area of BCP. Just a couple of things to just wanted to ask if they'd actually, well, one of them is, has it happened yet? Part of the way down, key mitigations actions, it says 6 working groups of officers and members put in place to develop high-level delivery plans for the corporate strategy. Are those groups in place? And then on the right-hand side, further actions, LGA peer challenge plan for November 2021, presumably a peer challenge, it will involve all councillors, is that correct?
Ms. Manton.
I must be honest and say I'm not clear on the answers to those. If I could take that away, and I will seek some answers and circulate the response to the committee, if I may.
Yes, that'll be fine. Thank you very much, Ms. Manton.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I had a note, Ms. Manton, around an update on CR9, and I thought that a colleague of yours was going to be speaking about that this evening.
Sorry, Chair, I wasn't aware of that. Can I defer to Mr. Stannard?
You can. I was told that Nicola Webb was going to be on the call this evening to deal with that item. Can you help, Mr. Stannard?
Yeah, I'm Nicola Webb here from speaking for Adam Richins. Yes,
thank you. Sorry, you've come up on the screen. I see you now. Thank you. Please go ahead, Ms. Webb. Thank you.
Okay, so this is a refresh really of this risk. It will have been there for some time really, but I think we're just concerned now that the risk, there's a lot of things happening. We've already mentioned about COVID and the impact of that, which has affected this risk. And also on the high needs budget, at the moment, the government have legislated that this isn't part of the general fund and we carry it forward separately as a separate reserve. But we know that runs out, not the end of this year, but the end of next. So clearly that budget has not yet been brought into balance and is still an issue for us. And if the legislation doesn't change, carry it forward, or we get extra funding from government, or we find new ways to manage our high needs block, potentially there's a very significant issue for the council in that the level of that deficit that we're carrying forward is going to continue to rise, and it won't be very long, only a couple of years, before it will exceed our unearmarked reserves. So it's just to be aware that that risk is there. The council's trying to manage it through obviously bringing down the deficit, lobbying government, and getting involved where we can to explain to government about this budget and how difficult it is to bring into balance. So having 6 weekly meetings, board meetings with the chief executive, the leader, other stakeholders such as the clinical commissioning group, to talk about this budget, because it's shared. The children are shared, they have medical interventions, education, all of these things come together. So we're trying to get a wide group of people looking at this issue to see how we can manage this budget and raise awareness of it really amongst all our partners. So that's quite a big issue for us in how we're trying to manage it. In the risk, there's some other key issues. The pay award has not yet been agreed. We've allowed in the budget for 1%. The employers have now offered 1.5%, and I think that's not yet been accepted, and I think it's been refused. So potentially in year we've got that risk to manage. Plus, clearly, if it's increased by more than we've allowed so far, it's going to knock on into future years. So that's quite a risk. Our transformation programme is another huge risk for us. We've built in 7.5 million this year in savings. They've not yet been found, and there's very significant saving targets in the next 2 years, about 17.5 million each year of the next 2. So very significant savings targets. And the transformation programme has started now, and we will hopefully build some more confidence over the next few months over what level of savings can be achieved, but we haven't yet established the detail of where they're going to come from. So it does remain quite a significant risk at this point. So there are some, we have got some mitigations. Clearly we're monitoring it through the High Needs Board, through meetings with the leader, the chief executive, that happen every month. Children's Services at the moment is showing some very significant pressures, and we've now instigated meetings with the corporate director of Children's. We're working through a programme of looking at the budget in a lot of detail, looking for ideas to try and bring that down. And because if we had to bake in the current level of additional funding over the medium-term financial plan, that will be very significant extra resources that are required. But those meetings have only just started. We've got one on Monday next week, and as I say, they're planned in for every two weeks to keep an eye on it and see what can be done. So I think that's why really we've wanted to put this risk in here now, because it can be very significant. It's growing, and we haven't yet got solutions to bring the budget yet into balance. Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to take any questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Ms. Webb. So, as members will be aware, particularly the items highlighted by Ms. Webb a moment ago, CR9 is around the council's ability to deliver a balanced outcome to the budget. And all of these issues individually are quite significant. Collectively would be quite overwhelming, I suspect, were they all to come together. I would like, if I may, and then I'll take questions from members of the committee, but I'd certainly like us to have a full update at our next quarterly meeting, please, which is on the 28th of October. And I'd interject before then, should your 2 weekly meetings be developing any kind of trend that really we should be aware of, and I would hope that you would be consulting with myself and the Vice Chairman so that we could agree or not that those should be then put in front of members of the committee prior to our meeting on the 28th of October. I think members will want to keep abreast of how those deliberations are going rather than to hear about them after decisions have been made. So perhaps if you can coordinate that with myself and the Vice Chairman, and we can decide if it's necessary how and when that information should be sent out to members of the committee. I think we'd find that extremely helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Members, have you any questions for Ms Webb? Well, in the absence of any questions, obviously we'll await that report in another quarter's time. I was going to suggest that perhaps Ms Manton could deal with both at that stage. I'm inclined, though, on reflection, having heard you outline those, if we could ask both of you to be here for our meeting on risk management at that stage. I think that would be helpful to members of the committee. So thank you both very much indeed. That takes us to the recommendation on the Risk Management Corporate Risk Register Update report. And the recommendation is that members of the Audit and Governance Committee note the update provided in this report relating to corporate risks. So members, are we happy to note the report from what we've heard this evening? Is that agreed? Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. So that takes us on to item 10 on the agenda. And item 10 is changes to the Council's Constitution and an update from the Chairman of the Constitution Review Working Group, who is Vice Chairman of this committee, Councillor Williams. I'd ask you, as Chairman of that working group, Councillor Williams, to provide us a verbal update on the work of the group following its meeting on the 20th of July 2021. Councillor Williams.
Thank you, Chairman. The working group received the final drafts of Part 2 articles and Part 4 procedure rules of the Constitution, which have been reviewed and updated with the support of the external solicitors to reflect the suggestions submitted by councillors and recommendations of the working group. The working group agreed the drafts and requested that a representative from Waitmans attend the Audit and Governance Committee when the proposals are discussed in order to answer any questions which members of that committee may have. Excuse me, I've got hay fever. The monitoring officer reported that work would now commence on a first draft of Part 3 delegation of functions. As before, BCO officers will prepare a draft for review by Waitmans before bringing it to the working group by the end of August. Next, we looked at the Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee. The working group considered the proposals for a formation of an additional Overview and Scrutiny Committee to work on matters, council services pertaining to the environment. This committee would enable the Overview and Scrutiny Board to retain its overarching role and maintain a strategic focus. The possible scope of the new Environment Overview and Scrutiny Committee was debated, and the working group agreed to support the establishment of a new committee and requested a further report on the possible division of work between this committee and the Overview and Scrutiny Board, which is to be discussed at a further meeting, to which the Chairman and Vice Chairman, that's myself and Councillor Butt, sorry, no, it's not. The chairman and vice chairman of Open and Scrutiny will be invited. Lastly, we looked at parish council requests for notification. The working group considered a request for parish councillors to receive notifications regarding matters affecting their parishes. The working group agreed to support the recommendations that Democratic Services provide parish clerks with details of wards falling wholly or partly within their parish, provide guidance on how to subscribe to notification, and a parish clerk to forward it to parish councillors for self-registration.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Williams. Now, I appreciate that 5 of us present are actually on that working group, but I think there are 3 members who are not. And so, no doubt that is tonight is the first time you'll have heard any of that, whereas the rest of us will have heard it before. And I'm sorry if that sounds a bit disjointed, but it's because the working group is a lesser number of people. I'll highlight just one of the things that Councillor Williams spoke about a moment ago, and maybe if members have got any questions of the chairman of the working group, you can then ask them. And my point, I think, was very much around this review of the overview and scrutiny function that we have on BCP Council, and making sure that the chair and vice chair of the overarching overview and scrutiny board have the opportunity to come to us as a committee before we then take those recommendations through to full council. We thought it was quite important to make sure that this was properly joined up, that the right consultation had taken place, and that the importance of the overarching overview and scrutiny board, its influence was heard by all of us, so that when we eventually take through recommendations to full council, hopefully everybody will agree by then, but at least we will have the opportunity of a debate if there are still any outstanding issues about those, how that new structure should be put in place. And it just seemed to us that we want to make sure that we get this right first time. So we've got a structure for overview and scrutiny at the moment. It isn't entirely fit for purpose. I think that's universally agreed because the workload's too big on one committee. But we want to make sure that when we do make the changes, that they're fit for purpose and that they will last and be effective. So that's really what that part of it was about. So members, any questions for Councillor Williams at this interim stage? Councillor Phipps.
So on 2 items really, the environment one we were just talking about, presumably then, it's gone again, a report will come through this committee, an actual written report of some sort, will it?
Yes.
Yes, okay, just checking, because we just, like you say, you just hit us with this verbally, those of us that knew nothing about it before.
This is, if I may interject, this is an update of our last meeting. There's no call to action at this particular meeting that we're at today. It's just really to put you in the picture.
Yeah, I just want clarification that we will get detail and a lot more will come forward. Yeah. And the other thing is notification of issues or whatever they are to parish councils, so that is welcome. But was it all issues or anything at all relating to each parish, or how would that work?
The request came from parish councillors, so I think Democratic Services are going to talk with them. Is that right, Karen?
I think the issue around parish notification was as a result of a question that came from a parish councillor, the chairman of the parish council, that went to full council in June, and it was referred to the Constitution Review Working Group, and it was in the context of notification to them in the same way that ward councillors may get notification on reports, as an example. So the purpose of bringing it to the Constitution Review Working Group was to consider what options were available, and the recommendations that Councillor Williams have outlined was what was supported by the working group. So I think the idea is to feed back to the gentleman that actually raised the issue in the first place, and based on those recommendations. I hope that clarifies it, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tompkins. So just to stress the point that you raised in general terms, this is just a verbal update on the work that's taking place since our last quarterly meeting of the committee. And yes, absolutely, we're not deciding anything this evening, it's purely an update. And when we are in a position of deciding, making decisions, it will be done in the normal format. There will be a report which comes out of working group for this committee to consider before it makes any recommendations, but then go forward to full council. Are there any other questions for Chairman of the Working Group? No, nobody's indicated. So, Councillor Williams, thank you very much, and thank you to members of the Working Group, on which I also sit, for the work that's being undertaken. It's a bit of a long process, but it is very important that we don't rush it and we do get it right, because otherwise we'll be revising council issues much further into the future than perhaps is good for us. So thank you for the work that's been undertaken. Look forward to the report coming forward. That takes us on to item 10 on the agenda, and item 10 is the annual review of Register of Declarations of Interests, Gifts and Hospitality by Officers Report 2020-21. And Mr. Stannard, the Head of Audit and Management Assurance, will introduce the report. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. So the next 4 reports actually are all assurance building blocks ready for you to approve the annual governance statement later on in the agenda, as well as being standalone reports in their own right. So this particular report is broken down into 2 core parts. The first part is shown at paragraphs 4 to 7 and reminds committee that you approved an evolution of the policy following an annual review report you received earlier in the year. And then the second part summarises the work of my internal audit team in testing the arrangements and reaching an overall opinion, which is that the arrangements are reasonable, but we do make a series of recommendations, and they are shown at paragraph 9 in the report. Paragraph 14 explains that our testing showed that 93 out of 94 of the council's senior officers, and by senior officers we mean tier 4 and above, so that's heads of service, service directors, corporate directors and the chief executive, have all completed and maintained their declaration forms. So on a risk basis, of course, that means that the key operational decision-making officers of the council have all got their declarations up to date, and obviously in the public's eye, importantly, those officers are the ones that could be influenced by a conflict of interest, a gift or a gift of hospitality. It is fair to say that there is still work to do on ensuring wider compliance across lower tiers and grades of staff across the council, but the risks are much lower because obviously those staff tend not to make the key operational decisions. So for those staff, it's more about embedding and demonstrably following the council's good governance processes and the Nolan principles. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Arnold. Members, do you have any questions? Councillor Fear.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's just one point, probably more around is this common practice across authorities. This on point 8, roles and responsibilities, 8.1, just in regards to use employees to use their own discretion. And I was just, and then sorry, I forget the bottom. Just on the summary stuff. Is that just common practice across authorities? It was just a little. I wouldn't say a niggle really. It was just a point I'd like to clarify. Thank you.
Mr. Stannard.
I would say that it's not explicit in other authorities' declarations of interest. However, there's always that underlying responsibility for all officers to make relevant declarations. What we're trying to do is to really ensure the governance is in place for officers who do make discretionary decisions, that all of those officers make a declaration, even if that declaration is they have nothing to declare. So it's not leaving anything for chance.
Thank you for that. Any other questions? In that case, we'll go to the recommendation, which is that Audit and Governance Committee note the annual review of Register of Declarations of Outside Interests and Receipts of Gifts and Hospitality by Officers 2020-21. Are we agreed to note the report? Yes, that is unanimous. Thank you, members. We'll now move on to item 11, which is the use of regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, that's RIPA for short, annual report for 2020-21, and it's you again, Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. As Councillor Beasley has already told what the acronym is, I'll use RIPA if that's okay. So best practice says that elected members of an authority should receive the authority's use of RIPA on at least an annual basis. So this report confirms that BCP Council in 2021 has not used RIPA powers to conduct covert surveillance that it could do. That would be a short report. So what we've also used the opportunity in the report to further explain a few things. So the report talks about the arrangements for rollout of the training associated with the policy that you approved earlier in the year. That's explained at paragraphs 6 and 7. The report also explains that the IPCO, that's the Information Investigation Powers Commission's office, they conducted a telephone-based assessment of BCP Council, which was attended by myself and Susan Zeiss, the monitoring officer, and one of their investigators. That is a precursor to a more in-depth inspection if the telephone conversation leads to that point. The good news for BCP Council, and this is explained in paragraph 10, is that the Chief Executive received a letter from the IPC Commissioner, Sir Brian Leveson, to say, quote, BCP is in a strong position should there ever be a need for covert surveillance to take place. So that was a good outcome. The IPC inspector, however, did make 4 recommendations to enhance our arrangements, and they're shown at paragraph 10. The last of these recommendations has already been implemented and is now embedded within the BCP RIPA central record, which is maintained by myself as the RIPA administrator, and that's shown at Appendix A. This involves explicitly recording what type of surveillance product is likely to exist. So, for example, would it be a CCTV image? Would it be a photographic image? Or would it be a report from an officer detailing what they've observed? So, all included in the appendix. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Stannard. Members, do you have any questions for Mr. Stannard on RIPA? Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you for the report and the summary. I think when we talked about the new RIPA policy recently, it was highlighted and we discussed about the fact that we needed that we have this annual report to be able to review, and I think it is important, even if the powers aren't being used, that we do have a sort of a report come before us so that we can be aware of what's going on. I suppose my question is that there are, I believe, I think there's been problems in the past where RIPA powers have been used where it was questionable, let's say, about whether they should have been used for those areas. But I'm of the opinion that there are definitely sort of responsibilities, enforcement responsibilities of this authority, where there will, from time to time, be occasions where the use of these powers is justified to investigate, alleged criminality, etc. And I just worry that the should we say bureaucracy that's been put around exercising these RIPA powers and the steps that have to go through and the amount of work that officers have to do to get authority to do it may be preventing us from actually enforcing, investigating and enforcing certain sort of issues that are our responsibility. So I don't know if you can comment on the amount of effort and work and paperwork and steps that have to go through to be able to do this, and whether you think that we will actually be using these powers at any time in the coming years. Because I'm aware that in Poole, they used one specific area where they were used in terms of, sort of consumer protection, environmental health sort of area. But yeah, I'd just be interested to know, are officers within those areas content that they do have the resources necessary to actually sort of justify these powers, or is it just not being done because we just don't have the sufficient officers and sufficient resources to actually put into these sorts of investigations?
That's a very useful question. Thank you, Councillor Brown. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. The training we received recently has placed, it's put us in a good position. Officers of the council do understand clearly when RIPA is and isn't necessary. So the bureaucracy, as you call it, is clear. It's there necessarily to protect human rights, basically, Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, and it is a last resort. That doesn't mean we can't do covert surveillance. And we do it in areas, as you allude to, in areas of enforcement, for example, but it doesn't need RIPA authorisation, and we're very clear where those boundaries are as a result of the training. So my overall message is I don't think it does preclude us. We're just very clear now when where the boundaries are and when we don't need and when we do need RIPA authorisation.
You need to come back, Councillor Brown.
Yeah, that is reassuring to an extent to know that these sorts of powers are being used, but maybe not requiring the full sort of RIPA authority, because the officers are clear what they can do within the sort of existing powers without actually having to sort of go to the sort of last resort. So that's good to know. I suppose it just does remain a concern that particularly in our sort of consumer protection and enforcement areas, that those are the areas that may have suffered with cuts over the last decade or so, and that may struggle with the sort of human and financial resources to actually properly investigate and enforce the sort of laws and regulations that we as an authority should be enforcing, should be investigating. And it just worries me from time to time that actually there may be people out there operating, black market operators, those sorts of things, that are getting away with things, where actually, because we're just not resourced as an authority to properly investigate and enforce those areas.
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not necessarily sure there's a question, there's probably a statement, but I could, for example, ask the Director of Communities, Kelly Ansell, to perhaps give you a response. It's a question about resourcing, essentially, isn't it? So I could ask Kelly to give Councillor Brown a response to that challenge.
Well, I think that would be very useful, Mr. Stannard, and perhaps she could copy in all members of the committee, because I think there's an underlying principle here. I don't think it's necessarily specifically confined to being able to resource adequate work around RIPA exclusively, but there is, I think, through the various other transformation works that are going on throughout the council to ensure that actually we aren't just maintaining, but we're improving standards, and that resources are adequate for the areas that they absolutely need to be. So I think that's the essence of the point. And if Kelly Ansell could do that and copy all of us, and I'm sure that if there are any issues not covered in that email, that members will go back to her with responses.
Noted, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. If there are no other questions, we'll move to the recommendation.
Chairman.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, Councillor Fear. Did I miss you?
That's right. Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, it was just a little bit backtracking on the governance. I sympathise a lot with what Councillor Brown was saying. Looking at it from the kind of other side as well as a kind of small state conservative, it's just sort of a reassurance looking forward going through this paper and under certain points like point 12 and 13 with the management of the chief exec and the director of communications and all those officers. Are you confident in the kind of transparency of the work that you do going through when this paper is taken forward, the work that you do when you meet, that there are enough safeguards and those sort of checks on the kind of opposite? Because I understand the security side, but then there's also the kind of civil liberties side as well. So it's just really looking for a reassurance that those sort of checks and balances are there and you're comfortable. Thank you.
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, again, the training we received recently in June sort of emphasised those factors, and those officers, particularly the authorising officers, are very clear of the constraints that they have to work within in approving a RIPA authorisation. It's not done lightly.
Thank you, members. So we'll now move on to the recommendation, which is the Audit and Governance Committee note that the Council has not made use of powers under the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act during the 2020-21 financial year. And in view of what we've heard from officers this evening, are you happy to note that recommendation? Yeah, I think that's unanimous, Mr. Tompkins. Takes us on to the next of your reports, Mr. Stannard, which is the Chief Internal Auditor's, that's the CIA's, annual option report, sorry, annual opinion report 2020-21. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. So the public sector internal audit standards require me to formally report annually on the adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's internal control environment. In many ways, though, this report is just a summary of what you've heard from me throughout the year. So if there's any new news in this, I really haven't been doing my job properly. There's perhaps a bit more detail and a bit of updating, but absolutely nothing of new news, hopefully you'll agree with. So my core opinion is shown at paragraph 5 of the covering report, and that is that BCP Council has in place an adequate and effective framework of governance, risk management and control. That doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't areas of control weakness and non-compliance with policies, for example, but internal audit have made a series of recommendations as reported to you through the year, accordingly to correct those issues, and management have agreed to implement in all circumstances. I'm sure you will have questions to ask me about other elements of this report, but I want to draw out the impacts of COVID and how we've ensured enough work has been done of quality and volume by the internal audit team to enable me to give this overall opinion. So paragraphs 6 and 9 of the covering report explain this in a bit more detail, and if we just do a really quick recap, So the internal audit team were repurposed to distribute COVID-19 business grants to local businesses, and we were doing basically eligibility and bank detail checks to ensure money was going to the right place. And broadly, that took between 6 and 8 weeks out of the audit plan. So Audit and Governance Committee agreed a revised audit plan on the 30th of July 2020 to take account of this and reprioritise on a risk basis some of the original plan. Later on in the year, CIPFA issued guidance to Chief Internal Auditors, leadership teams and audit committees, stating that a limitation of scope opinion may be necessary. Now, this is always an option available to Chief Internal Auditors. It's not new, so CIPFA were really reminding Chief Internal Auditors that this was an option. I introduced this limitation of scope principle to you through the 2020 year, but by January 2021, I was flagging to you that I thought we would be able to do the work and coverage necessary in the plan, so I wouldn't need to produce a limitation of scope opinion. I'm happy to confirm that this is the case. Chairman, though, I'd just like to draw your attention to paragraph 10 and 11 on page 124 of our packs, and allow me to just formally thank my team, whose efforts have enabled me to report this position to you tonight. They've been tremendously flexible and pragmatic in their working hours, working additional hours, and remarkably, across a staff base of 13.5 staff, we'd lost just 7 working days last financial year, so less than half a day per person. So thank you for allowing me to make that point, Chairman, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Stannard. Just before we do, certainly, and I'm sure this applies to every member of this committee, would like to endorse your gratitude to the relatively small staff team for their flexibility and focus during this period. I know, and the Vice Chairman know as well as anybody, because you tell us how that has had impacts on other work, but more importantly, how the team has gelled together to really prioritise the work in a way that I think is a fine example, you know, of local government working to its very best. And when we get to the recommendation, I think perhaps the committee might like to add suitable wording to that recommendation in terms of thanking and congratulating your team of internal audit in the way that you've just suggested.
Thank you.
So, members, any questions on this item for Mr. Stannard? Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, thank you very much. Page 125, we've got the paragraph 15 and 16. So it gives the assurance level definitions, and then 16 tells us how many of each we've got, and obviously there's a great list of them further down. Most of them are reasonable. I thought, you know, on first look, I thought, oh, that's absolutely great. I'm sure it is. But it actually says for reasonable, whilst there is basically sound control framework, there are some weaknesses which may put the service objectives at risk. So would you expect normally, I mean, this is one council, and presumably you do, if you do other councils, or, you know, where are we with this? Like, is that normal to have that amount of reasonable and not as many substantial, where they're really, you know, top notch? I realise we haven't got very many partial either. We seem to be sort of stuck in the middle there. Is that sort of acceptable, or are there things in place to perhaps bring more of these up to the substantial level rather than just being sat at a mediocre level? That's my words. Thank you.
Mr. Stannard.
Just tackling the definitions first of all. Some audit teams, by the way, we are only a BCP audit, internal audit team. We don't do any work for, well, sporadic work for other, charter trustees, for example. But broadly speaking, it's just BCP Council. And whilst definitions do subtly change across internal audit teams, across councils, these are pretty standard. And in terms of the sort of meat to your question, Councillor, is that the team is resourced to provide reasonable assurance. We could provide substantial assurance on a lot more of work we do, but we'd need to spend a lot more time and a lot more resource, and therefore that reasonable level is what we've pitched in the audit charter, that it's not quite as blunt as soon as we get to a reasonable assurance we turn the audit off, but there is an element of truth to that. So we're not striving to find substantial assurance. We are basically resourced to say reasonable is good enough.
Yeah, okay. Well, I appreciate that, and thank you for the explanation. I was just, on a look at it, it doesn't kind of come across that that is the case. And then you read that and you think, there are weaknesses that may put the service objectives at risk. But I appreciate what you said, and I understand where you're coming from, but that possibly doesn't come across in the report that that is the case. But thank you very much.
I think perhaps that question does lead on to perhaps a little further explanation from you, Mr. Stannard, in terms of your comment that reasonable is good enough. In terms of your professional opinion, could you perhaps just expand on that a little bit? Because I'm conscious that members of the public may not actually understand the background to that, and I think perhaps it shouldn't just be left hanging there as a phrase. I think it needs a little bit more explanation so that anybody listening into this meeting would understand why that is a satisfactory outcome from your professional perspective.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, from a professional perspective, I've got responsibilities to my professional function to ensure that this overall opinion is based on grounded and appropriate levels of assurance, and reasonable in that context does reach that level. I appreciate Councillor Phipps's comments about there are some weaknesses. There are weaknesses in some of the, most of the audits we do come up with recommendations. So therefore, by definition, there are some weaknesses in what we're finding. So that's the context in which we're working in.
And I take it, just as a follow-up, that if you ever had any concerns about the resource issue to enable you to take anything to the next stage if you felt it necessary, and those resources weren't forthcoming, you would come to this committee to make that case. Because I think, certainly my experience of audit and governance in one of the predecessor councils where I was leader, I used to get quite often challenged by the chair and members of the committee around those resource issues, whether that resource was going to be forthcoming or whether actually it was going to curtail the activities of internal audit.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Again, it is a requirement of my profession that I've got to speak up if I thought that there weren't adequate resource in the team to produce this opinion. And I am supported by the Chief Executive and Adam Richards in that sense. So I'm very confident that if I went to either of those officers in our statutory officers meetings with that comment, that I would be supported.
So thank you, Councillor Peer. Put myself on the mic again. When we get to the minuting of this meeting, I think I could ask Mrs. Tompkins to record the essence of what you have just said in a phrase, so that actually all members of the council who read those minutes would understand the point that you were making, and that you would come back to this committee having had consultation with the Chief Financial Officer and the Chief Executive. So that would be, I think, welcome by members of the committee.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Brooke, I apologise for intervening with 2 follow-up questions and delaying your question.
That's quite all right, Chairman. In a way, my question was partly your question, and Mr. Sannard has responded, but I would like just to have confirmation, first of all, that where it is reasonable, but you do find some weaknesses within that service unit, you do actually make recommendations to ensure those weaknesses are removed. And in response to that, is there any way in which you can follow up to ensure that those recommendations have actually been enacted, or is it left? Because obviously with the resources and the way you do the checks, you won't necessarily come back to those the next year with that same service unit. So how do you follow up on the recommendations that you've actually made?
Thank you, Councillor Brooke. Yes, in the audit charter that the Audit and Governance Committee agree on an annual basis, there is the follow-up procedure is set out in that charter. So high and medium recs are followed up on the when they become due. So if we put a date, for example, of 31st of March, they'd be followed up the week after. Medium recs are followed up within 12 months or at the next audit, whichever is quicker. And then low recs is basically management advice, and we would follow that up at the next audit because obviously it's low risk, low priority. It's not management discretion to implement per se, because as reported, 100% of recommendations, whether they're high, medium or low, have been implemented by management and accepted by management.
Fine, thank you for that. I think that adds that extra little bit of detail that you will see, Chair.
Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, it's a useful report. My question's around, I think, comment C in here about the adequate arrangements to deter and detect fraud, and I sort of take the point that the conversation earlier that we need to look for having adequate arrangements, but it would be nice to have very strong arrangements to sort of deter and detect fraud or something like that, and accept that there are weaknesses in some areas. I mean, it's been my view for a while that there are sort of some weaknesses around awareness of fraud, and I accept that it's different in different service unit areas, and the risk is different. But and it refers a little bit back to the sort of risk assessment discussion right at the start of the meeting. Actually, there was a section in there about fraud risk assessment, which talked about fraud awareness is in the induction process, and fraud awareness e-learning module is set up and provided to all employees and part of the induction process. But following things I've heard recently about the amount of sort of training that staff may or may not have done, I'm concerned that we've got an e-learning module on fraud. It's set up, but it's provided to all employees as part of the induction process. But actually, do we know how many of our employees are actually going through that fraud training to improve their awareness and knowledge of the frauds that they could come across through their work and what to do in those cases? So I suspect you may not have the answer now, but it may be part of the annual report that we get in October around counter fraud and those sorts of areas. That actually, do we have any way of knowing how many of our staff have done that sort of e-learning and do have some awareness of fraud prevention and what actions to take if they suspect something? Or do we just know that the training is there if they want to do it, but do we know actually how many are doing it? Have we got, I'm guessing we don't have 100% of people who have done it, but how do we monitor that?
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. A couple of things on that. So the more general comment around general awareness of staff and the take-up of mandatory training. Corporate Management Board have agreed a comprehensive timetable for people to undertake mandatory training, and by mandatory we mean mandatory. So what has been put in place is every month this calendar year a mandatory training has been flagged to one particular month. Now fraud awareness was flagged in May, so people were required to do mandatory training in May, and the process is going to be that the head of HR reports to Corporate Management Board on the take up of mandatory training through those each month cycles. So I would guess that the information is going to be produced quite soon for the mandatory training take up of fraud awareness in May, if it isn't already. So I can probably provide that information to you offline.
That, either that or whether it may form a comment within your annual report about fraud, whistleblowing, etc. You know, I think it would be useful for the committee to be assured that actually, you know, mandatory training of staff is reaching most of our staff rather than a minority. So
I think, Mr. Stannard, the useful information, if that information could be collated and perhaps you put out a note that either you can give the answers at the time of the note or that it'll be coming forward relatively soon anyway. Is that your understanding, Mr. Stannard?
Yes, Chairman, I'll do that. And just on the sort of more specialist training, just to assure you on that, I've got a standalone specialist fraud investigator within the internal audit team, ex-Met policeman. You know, obviously he's trained through his previous role in certain things, but we also keep his CPD up to date through training through the year for him. And we've also got a couple of other auditors who we're training to try and provide that resilience should we lose that individual to you know another job or whatever. So yeah, we're trying to build up that specialist expertise in the audit team. So things like how to right to buy frauds, leaseholder fraud, those sort of things.
Thank you, Mr. Stannard. I don't think members of the committee doubt that there isn't a proper grip on all of this. I think it's more a question of actually having the information to hand so that we've got that confirmation and we've got a better understanding of exactly what's going on and how timely it is. So thank you for that. So members, takes us to the recommendation, which is that the Audit and Governance Committee note the Chief Internal Auditor's annual report and opinion on the overall adequacy of the internal control environment for BCP Council. I think along the way, two other things perhaps to add to that. The first is our gratitude to the internal audit team in the way that we expressed earlier on, and I'm sure Mrs. Tompkins can incorporate that into our recommendation outcome. And alongside all of that, to get a slightly wider explanation in the minutes themselves of the issues that were raised originally by Councillor Phipps, augmented by Councillor Brooke, by myself, by Councillor Brown, to try and make sure that we've got a point of reference in there to these issues specifically being discussed and the way we saw them being taken forward for the future. I think the committee, from a governance perspective, would very much like to see those expressed in the minutes. So perhaps, Mr. Stannard, you could coordinate with Mrs. Tompkins to ensure that that's the outcome. So members, are we agreed to note in the way that the recommendation sets it out?
It's unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that was time well spent, members of the committee. Takes us on to item 13 on the agenda, which is the annual breaches and approved waivers of financial regulations report for 2020-21, and that's you again, Mr. Stannard.
Chair, excuse me. So just before we dig into this report, I might be stating the leading obvious here, but breaches are a bad thing. and waivers demonstrate good governance and good awareness of the flexibilities offered to us through our own financial regs and public contract regulations 2015. So turning to breaches first of all, there were 5 breaches totalling £871,000 shown in the table and at paragraph 3 at the top of page 137, is it? The explanation as to why these breaches occurred is shown in paragraphs 4 and 5 respectively. And I hope you agree that whilst no breach is good, this breach circumstance does not highlight any fundamental governance or lack of awareness. It's more of an administrative oversight, which is now corrected. So not great, but you know, in the circumstances, it's not a huge concern in terms of the fundamental misunderstandings of either the council's financial regs or public contract regulations 2015. So then moving on to waivers, 116 waivers totaling 12.6 million. And just in context, the council spends about £400 million a year on third-party spend. So 12.6 million of that is about 2.5%, 3% in that sort of ballpark. I say in that sort of ballpark because we have to reflect that the 12.6 million waivers is not an annualised figure. Some of those waivers are over 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, etc. So it's not quite, there's a bit of apples and pears there. So the table at paragraph 12 breaks down the waivers by category, and then paragraphs 13 and 15 explain the 2 big generalised reasons for why there were more waivers this year compared to last. So obviously COVID, 2 factors within COVID. There's the urgency factor, which we can all intuitively understand, but there was also a limited supplier scenario where business was furloughed, some businesses were furloughed, and some suppliers didn't have certain products. So there was a limited supplier market also came to fruition through the COVID period. And then the second issue is the council's own transformation agenda. So there have been some waivers to extend contracts for incumbent suppliers to allow time for redesign and to align contracts that Legacy Bournemouth, Legacy Poole, Legacy Christchurch might have had for the same service, so they all end at the same point, and then we can move nicely forward as a BCP contract. So Appendix 1 shows all the 116 waivers that have been agreed, and I pulled out at paragraph 17 the more significant waivers by financial value and provided a little bit more in-depth commentary in that paragraph 17. However, if a councillor has any questions concerning any other waivers, I may be able to answer it tonight, but I may have to provide a written answer because it's quite hard to keep the information of 116 waivers in your mind. So I might be able to tackle that if it's a depends on the type of question, I guess what I'm saying. So happy to take any questions on that, councillors.
Questions, Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. I know you commented on the fact that the number of breaches was down from 8 to 5 from last year to this. If you trace the figures that you've given us for 18, 19, 19, 20 and 2021, we've seen an increase in the actual amount of money associated with breaches, increasing from £3,000 to 171,000 to a 5-fold increase to £870,561. So it does seem to me that while the breaches might be reduced, the impact of those breaches is increasing significantly and or detrimentally significantly. Could you comment on that, please?
Thank you, Chair. You're absolutely right, Councillor Brooke. You've stated fact there. There's no hiding behind that. The breaches were relatively modest. This particular scenario, it was 5 breaches that were all going to be produced as waivers, and for whatever reason, those waivers weren't produced on time. So, maybe a unique situation this year. Yeah. Besides those 5, wouldn't have had any. So because they all occurred in one lump. Yeah.
Did you want to come back on that, Councillor Brooke?
Not really, Chair. I don't think there's anything to add one way or the other, or to delve. It's a straightforward fact that we're heading on towards £1 million that was, if you like, not dealt with it legally. Being a breach of regulations, and I think while there may be some sort of excuses through COVID and everything else, it is something that we are going to have to look at in the future to make sure that people do keep to time if they are going to issue waivers with regard to contracts and renewals and so on.
So just before I take Councillor Phipps' question, unless it's directly related to that issue, I was going to suggest, Mr. Stannard, that the points highlighted by Councillor Brooke are absolutely critical to us. 2 of those 5, and indeed all 5 are in children's services, but 2 of those 5 are very substantial amounts. And whether or not they would have resulted in a waiver, I think what will be concerning to the committee will be what steps have been taken to ensure that that such breaches do not occur, certainly of this magnitude, in the future. Given that they are all in children's services, given that 2 of them are way away from what's been experienced in the previous 2 years, and that it isn't then acceptable that, well, we'll get on with the work of obtaining a waiver when we do, in for example, this example, children's services, to save you all the difficulty of dealing with such breaches. Have you been able to put in place guidance that do you think will be reflected in the actions of that service, or indeed any other service in the future? Because I think this committee would certainly support you in pursuing that agenda and pursuing it rigorously, because the public perception will not be favourable to the council, even if it hasn't materially made any difference.
Thank you, Chairman. In response to your question, I'm content that the corporate director, Elaine Redding, has put in arrangements in place which I've reviewed, and I'm content with that. That particular issue, touching wood, of course, can't happen again through the arrangements that have been put in place within children's services to prevent it happening. And in relation to a comment by Councillor Brooke, if I could just clarify that breaches are a breach of the council's financial regulations, not a breach of the law. So there's no question that we've breached the law here. We've just not followed our own governance processes in signing or extending a contract. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may just come back, I apologise if I used the wrong word there, using the word legally, but I was referring to the fact that we have regulations, and in a way they are legal to this council and therefore need to be upheld.
Yes, and I think I would certainly support the sentiment that Councillor Brooke is explaining this evening, and it's for this committee to hold to account the organisation around such governance issues. So I think it's really important that we're discussing these in the way that we are this evening, and it may be that the committee would agree that if you are confirming that in writing to Children's Services, that the sentiments expressed by Audit and Governance this evening are reflected in what you actually tell them. It has been noticed, and Audit and Governance will not want to be seeing a repeat performance by Children's Services or any other service this time next year. And I think that again is another tool to help you exert that leverage that perhaps you're looking for.
Thank you, Chairman, and noted. Thank you.
I apologise for the delay. Councillor Phipps, your question.
It's okay. It's something really as a matter of interest. It's pretty small beer in the scheme of things, but page 146, dog kennelling, £12,000. What do we do with that then? Is that stray dogs or something? Where does that come from? Seems quite a lot. That's all.
Yeah, absolutely right, Councillor Phipps. It's stray dogs, and I don't have the actual detail to hand. It may be that that's a contract over several years rather than 1 year. But again, if you want that information, I can provide that for you.
No, it's not necessary. I just wondered. Just seemed quite a lot. But it could be over several years then in that case.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Members, if there are no further questions, I'll move on to the recommendation, which is that the Audit and Governance Committee note the breaches and waivers of financial regulations that occurred during 2020-21, and perhaps we'd like to add to that recommendation what we were discussing and I hope agreeing a moment ago to give Mr. Stannard that additional leverage with services of the Council as far as internal audit is concerned. And I feel sure that a suitable form of words can again be transcribed to Mrs. Tompkins for inclusion in the minutes, if that is the wish of the committee. Would members of the committee, in noting this, confirm that that is their wish to go forward?
Unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you, members. That takes us to item 14 on the agenda, which is Mr. Stannard's penultimate report, and that's the annual governance statement 2020-21, an annual review of the local code of governance. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. So the annual governance statement it's an important document for the council. It forms part of the council's statement of accounts. They won't be approved for some time, so we're approving the AGs subject to anything that may crop up in terms of the statement of accounts, and we will accordingly bring the annual governance statement back to you if there are any issues necessary that mean we need to make any changes. So the AGS is produced as a consequence of an extensive assurance gathering process, and this is detailed at paragraph 6 in the report. Some of those elements are conducted at year end, like the completion, for example, of the service directors and corporate directors assurance statements, and then other elements are more permanent fixtures, like the work of the internal audit team, for example. So the AGS for 2021 concludes that BCP Council has effective and fit for purpose governance arrangements in place in accordance with our approved governance framework, which is shown at Appendix 2. As you might expect in such a large complex organisation as BCP, not everything's perfect. So the AGS seeks to highlight areas where we think we need to make governance improvements. There are 2 areas meeting this criteria, and they're highlighted at paragraph 33, governance of children's social services and governance arrangements with external bodies. They were both issues in the previous year's annual governance statement, and whilst good progress has been made on resolving the fundamental issues, there's still work to do, and that's why they still feature in the annual governance statement this year. The There's an action plan to address the issues, and they're shown in Table 1 on page 168 of our packs. And annual A&G committee will have an update on the progress on that action plan at its January 22 meeting, and this is embedded in the forward plan, which we'll see later on in the agenda. Best practice guidance is issued annually to help councils in their AGS production, and this year that guidance suggests that councils should specifically comment on how COVID-19 has impacted, and that's shown on page 162 of our annual governance statement, starting at paragraph 13. And it also suggests we should look at how we're working towards implementing the financial management code during 2021, and we've included this at paragraph 25, page 164 of the AGS. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stannard. Members, do you have questions? It would appear not, Mr. Stannard, so we'll go straight to the recommendations, of which there are 3. The first one is that the annual governance statement for 2020-21 for BCP Council is approved, and the leader and chief executive are asked to formally sign it. The second is the BCP action plan to address significant governance issues is approved, and a progress update will be presented to Audit and Governance Committee in January 2022. And the third is that the local code of governance, which is subject to evolution to reflect changing governance arrangements, is noted. Members, will you support those 3 recommendations taken together?
Chairman, that's unanimous.
Thank you very much indeed, members. Takes us to the final report from Mr. Stannard, which is internal audit, the quarterly audit plan update for quarter 1, 2021-22. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chairman. So having previously looked at annual reports, we're now back into the standard quarterly update on work of the internal audit team. So quarter 1 is always a busy period for internal audit, and simplified, there are 4 significant areas of work we're doing. Firstly, we're getting the previous year's audit plan over the line quickly, but without compromising. Secondly, we're kicking off the new year audit plan. Thirdly, we're obviously producing the annual governance statement that we just looked at. And finally, we're finalising the work necessary in producing my Chief Internal Auditor's report that we've already looked at as well. So paragraph 4 explains in a bit more detail about the community infrastructure levy partial audit opinion that we've had to issue as one of the 3 audits that have been completed so far this year. Paragraph 5 highlights the good progress that we're making in kicking the plan off for 2021. And then the other sort of significant area of work that we've had to do this quarter is the assurance work that the government has required post-payment for all the government grants that have been dished out to businesses using specified government toolkits and tools. Finally, I'd just like to draw your attention to paragraphs 9 and 10. And this was the CIPFA have conducted their 3-day external validation of the internal audit function. That's to confirm that BCP's internal audit team complies with public sector internal audit standards. Good news for you, we conform. But the CIPFA have got to ratify that report at their Quality Assurance Board. So we've yet to have the official results, so we'll bring that officially to you in October. But what we do think that there's going to be 4 relatively minor recommendations and 4 suggestions in ways that we can improve our own processes within internal audit. Happy to take any questions, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Members. Do you have any questions? Councillor Brooke.
Chair, it's more an observation and comment than a question, which is that I shouldn't be pleased, but I am very pleased to see the way in which the audit has picked up the issues regarding community infrastructure levy. As now currently Vice Chair of Broadstone Neighbourhood Forum and heavily involved in the SIL monies that are supposedly coming to us and their expenditure as well, it has been very clear that there is absolutely no control, no watching of the funds, no management of the funds that would give one confidence, late payments and so on. So it really has been quite a rough road that neighbourhood forums are travelling, I think, with regard to that. And I think some of the points here and the recommendations, hopefully, will help to sort that out. But there is certainly a need and a very urgent need for this particular financial element to be sorted.
And I would endorse every word that Councillor Brooke has just uttered on SIL. I don't know, Councillor. So I don't know whether Councillor Brooke would want me to ask you, Mr. Stannard, as a question supplementary to that. Do you feel that you have sufficient resource to exercise your functions around SIL, which is quite a fragmented structure and will obviously take additional resource for a newish piece of work that you'll need to undertake going forward?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'm content. We have sufficient resource. We'll be following up those recommendations in the way I outlined earlier in the meeting. I would say, partial assurance does mean partial. We could have given minimal assurance. We haven't. There are elements of good practice and good work in that system. But I agree with Councillor Brooke, there are significant weaknesses as well, and hence that partial assurance opinion.
Thank you. Any questions? Sorry, Councillor Trent.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. On the SIL bit, I note that a high priority comment was there was no formal decision-making process covering all aspects of SIL expenditure or policy detailing how funds are apportioned. And it mentions on Paul and the legacy procedures. We've got a situation now where there were SIL bids submitted at the beginning of July, but no one actually seems to know who will be dealing with that. It is particularly relevant in Poole. I was on the SIL panel that looked at last year's pool-wide bids, along with a number of other councillors. It was balanced for the councillors representing Poole. And we've got that coming up this year, but there is no panel in place to deal with that. Just the possibility that it might go to 2 or 3 people that may not even be connected with that area, because it is a legacy bidding process this year. It's the last legacy bidding process, but there doesn't seem to be any understanding of where that's going. So I think it is a high priority to get something sorted and to get a properly balanced representative panel to consider these things, because otherwise money's being bid for from various communities and nobody really knows where it's going. So it's just really emphasising that there is a problem there, and the pool side, which is particularly challenging because it's basically the second part of a two-part process that started last year. There was a structure in place, and I just wonder whether that ought to be revived for this round, and then have a long-term structure beyond that, which involves representatives from across the council, or maybe even have sort of localised panels, so that where you've got broader seal bids, that you don't get someone from one end of the conurbation deciding what is acceptable and what's not acceptable on a seal bid from the opposite side of the conurbation. So I do think it does need looking at, and I'm glad to see it mentioned here.
Mr. Stannard.
I think again I sort of endorse Councillor Brooks' comments that it's not good, but it's reassuring that internal audit have found what councillors and communities are experiencing. So something's working, something's where. So yeah, thank you.
Councillor Brown.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, actually on the same subject about planning and community infrastructure levy, the partial assurance. I was a little bit surprised when I read this, because I know, go back a couple of years, I suppose, full planning, having conversations with officers where I was reasonably impressed that they were doing the liability assessments, invoicing, and chasing those invoices for payment. Because I remember a case where I suspect some of the developers and builders in this area, just leave it as long as they can, and it got to the point of on the verge of a court case when the check suddenly came through from the developer because they didn't want to be in court for the collection of that outstanding invoice, the check of some thousands and thousands of pounds, So I was always aware that they were raising invoices, and they were chasing them, and they were going down the legal route if they weren't paid by developers. So I'm wondering where this one's come from in terms of, has it previously been okay? I accepted Paul Seal was probably different to Bournemouth and Christchurch because it was more substantial and it's more of a developed policy than the other boroughs, because it notes a couple of places that there's an absence of procedures for Bournemouth and Christchurch, legacy procedures in Paul. So I'm just a bit concerned about where this has come, how this has arisen, when what I'd heard previously was it was done fairly well. But is it a part of the amalgamation, and now looking at it as a whole of BCP, that actually having three different ways of doing it is causing problems, or is it the pressure that we've got within planning that sort of caused these issues? Really, sort of where it's come from.
Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Brown. It's as the Chairman previously stated. Really, it's a legacy is definitely an issue. And as I alluded to, it's not all bad. There are good pieces of work. You're right, invoicing is generally good, but there are other facets of the seal procedure which are not good. So we're commenting as an overall rather than legacy pockets here. It's the overall opinion. At the end of the day, it's a BCP function, not a legacy council function. And that's what we're citing our opinion on.
And I'm sure members of the committee, given some of the comments that have been made this evening, are grateful to you for being so candid around the subject. But of course, ultimately, to resolve these issues requires the resource within that part of the council to be adequate for its purpose, but also to be effective for its purpose. And not holding you to account for any of that, obviously, but you are flagging up this information. I'm sure we'd all want to be sure that if there are any shortcomings in those regards, that is then taken forward to the appropriate senior management of the council. And I'm sure that this committee wouldn't want you to be rehearsing the same findings this time next year. and finding that actually not very much has been done within that part of the council to resolve the issues. So I suspect that we will be very supportive of you going forward and trying to make sure that that's what happens.
Thank you, Chairman. And again, as I said earlier, the follow-up arrangements that we've got in the charter will be followed to the letter. So when that high recommendation becomes due, I can't recall the exact date that we've agreed with the service that high priority recommendation should be implemented by. But in the week after that implementation date, we'll be following it up and asking, has it been done?
Thank you. I have one very brief question, and again, it concerns the resources available to internal audit. You mentioned earlier work that you were doing around follow-up from government grants throughout the COVID pandemic and the monies that have been made available in lots of different ways by the government. Presumably that is an additional resource issue for internal audit, as we heard earlier, possibly to the disadvantage of other pieces of work you would be doing. Do you feel that you do have sufficient resource to be undertaking that work, no doubt at some pace at the moment, or is it causing you any concerns from an internal audit perspective?
Thank you, Chairman, for asking. I'm confident at the moment that we, in the audit plan, there is a contingency budget for through the door work, investigations, whistleblowing, these sort of things that the government springs upon us. So there is flexibility in the audit plan, deliberately so. And I don't think the work we're doing so far for the government is going to breach that contingency that we've got in the plan. So I think it's all containable at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Stannard. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. Sorry to be a little bit pedantic on this, but looking through page 186 with the recommendations for dealing with the SIL management, it says there are 9 recommendations, 1 high, 7 medium, 1 low. Actually, there are 8 bullet points, 2 of which are high and 6 are medium, and there are no low. So there's a slight discrepancy between the text, explanatory text, and the actual recommendations, unless something's being missed off.
Is that just an iteration issue, Mr. Stannard, or is it something more fundamental?
Sorry, Chairman. Sorry, Councillor Brooke. I don't have an answer for that.
No, I mean,
it might be a typo. Yeah, I'll need to go away and have a look at that.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the difference between what's presented and what's stated, if you like. I'm not too fussed, but because the recommendations are good.
I've got a sneaky feeling that the low priority recommendation isn't shown and deliberate, because just be a very minor issue on something. That was my gut feel, but I can't say for certain.
That's understood. There are 2 high.
Could perhaps any corrections be?
Yes.
Thank you very much. So if there are no further questions, I'll take us to the recommendation, which is that the Audit and Governance Committee are asked to note progress made and issues arising on the delivery of the 2021-22 internal audit plan. Are we happy to note that recommendation?
That's unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Stannard, for your many reports. You can now relax for a moment. Takes us to item 16 on the agenda, which is the External Auditor Audit Plan 2020-21 and Progress Report and Sector Update. We have with us this evening Peter Barber and Sam Harding from Grant Thornton. Good evening, both. It was your predecessor's desire to put external audit at the end of our agenda so that you could witness the work of the Audit and Governance Committee. I'm sorry that we've made you wait for so very long. If you at any stage in the future would like to deal with this differently and be further up the agenda, please let me know or let Mrs Tompkins or Mr Stannard know, and we'll see what we can do to change it. It is just that you will always put at the end really at your own request. So I'll leave it as that until I hear otherwise. But you're very welcome, and I think the committee are anxious to hear you introduce your report. Over to you, Mr Barlow.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for those words. I'm absolutely happy to be anywhere on the agenda. Good evening, everybody. We have two brief reports within this item on the agenda. The first of which is our audit plan, which begins on page 195 of your papers. And essentially sets out our approach to discharging our responsibilities for the financial year 2021. And then we have our progress report that starts on page 225. So I'll start with the audit plan, and just to remind members of the Audit and Governance Committee that as your external auditors, our responsibilities are twofold. Firstly, to give an opinion on your financial statements, and secondly, to issue a value for money conclusion. Even though external audit is a retrospective exercise, we would normally, in any normal year, have aimed to bring this plan earlier in the audit cycle, but the timing of this plan and presentation to this committee reflects the late commencement of our planning for this year, which was delayed due to the extra time needed to complete our previous year's audit. Our approach to issuing the opinion and the VFM conclusion is summarised in the plan on page 200 of your papers. If I start with the opinion, when I do come to sign off your 2021 financial statements, hopefully later this year, I will not do so to the pound, but I will work to a materiality level. That invariably within audit is based on a percentage of your gross spend. You'll see in the detail that for BCP for 2021, we've opted for 1.4% of your spend for the year, which at the planning stage equated to 11.56 million for the group, and a very slightly smaller figure of 11.5 million for the council. And essentially this means that within your accounts, which we've now received, that within the primary statements, any entry in excess of that £11.5 million will be subject to some degree of enhanced audit procedures that enable us to gain assurance over the completeness and accuracy of those disclosures. In addition to that, all entries within the financial statements, whether they're primary statements, whether they're notes, whether they're financial or other, they will be agreed to some form of evidence, third-party evidence, to demonstrate that they're appropriate, and that exercise will also include reconciling the accounts in totality and the primary statements back to your general ledger and trial balance for the year end. Now, there are some entries within the accounts that are deemed to be of heightened risk of misstatement, and these invariably will result in more detailed testing. And these are listed under the significant risks on page 200. So just in terms of those, I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes going through those. The first bullet point under significant risks is management overrider controls. And these are the elements of the accounts that are subject to greatest estimation and judgment. But they also include things like journals, and journals are a really effective way of moving monies, income or expenditure, should the council wish to do so, between expenditure or income codes, or dare I say, between years. So we get particularly exercised about journals, and there will be a whole raft of audit procedures we do to identify all journals, risk assess them, and test a sample to satisfy ourselves that they're appropriate. The other two bullet points are specific to the balance sheet within your accounts. So within the balance sheet at the very top, you will have land and buildings and investment properties, very significant balances that require, as was discussed earlier, they require a judgment, and to that end, BCP bringing valuation experts to provide that. We spend a lot of time understanding the instructions that you as a council make to your valuers, what you do with it when you get it back from your valuer, how that translates into the figures in the accounts, and we will look to gain our own assurance that those disclosures are reasonable and appropriate. Just as you've got a very big asset at the top of the balance sheet, you'll have a very large liability at the bottom of your balance sheet, which will be the net pension liability. And once again, this will be subject to detailed audit procedures. A lot of that information comes from the actuary, and we will be interested in how the actuary has arrived at those figures, and there will be various procedures that we'll go through to get assurance over those disclosures. You'll note that within this plan, we spend some time discussing accounting estimates, and I'm not going to go into detail for that area, not least because I'm conscious that Mr. Filmer at item 5 talked about the enhanced requirements of estimates under ISA 540. Suffice to say that those areas that are listed in item 5 in your response to our inquiries will be helpful in informing the work that we do at the post-statement stage. So that's a very brief run through on the opinion. Just very briefly on the VFM approach. I think this has been trailed at previous meetings of this committee. VFM means lots of things to lots of people. For external audit, it is based on criteria set by the National Audit Office. They review the criteria every 5 years. They've just gone through an exercise, and this year that we're auditing, 2021, is the first year of a new approach. There are 3 new criteria. There is governance, there is economy, efficiency and effectiveness, and there is financial resilience. There are a number of risks that we've identified that we'll focus on, and those are detailed at the bottom of page 200. So we will be looking at all 3 areas, and we will be going into much more detail than we did in year 1 at BCP. In each of those areas, we will be commenting on your arrangements. We will be identifying good practice that we've identified within the council. We will be looking to share best practice from elsewhere, and where appropriate, we'll be making recommendations. If we think there are minor areas for improvement to refine arrangements, we will issue an improvement recommendation. If we think that there are weaknesses such that those are key to an area, we will issue key recommendations. And if we think there are real concerns, and this would be the nuclear option and by exception, but wouldn't be unknown within local government, we can issue, should we deem it appropriate, statutory recs that would require a formal response from the council. We'll be looking at all 3 areas, but we will be focusing on those bullet points that we picked out on page 200. So we will be looking at your arrangements for addressing the weaknesses identified by the Ofsted report in respect of children's services and how you're responding to that. We will be looking at the learning from COVID and how you are looking to capitalise on the benefits of maybe some of the different models of service delivery you've introduced given the restrictions. We will be looking at medium-term financial planning, and I suspect that all my colleagues who are undertaking similar audits across the country will be doing something similar, recognising the significant financial challenges faced across all local government bodies, austerity, ever-increasing expectations of the public, increased demands for service-led services such as children's and adults, and invariably, the difficulty in raising income and the increase in unit costs that lots of councils are facing. I'm also conscious that, that earlier in today's session, there were discussions about the transformation programme, and Nicola Webb referenced that. We're particularly interested in the transformation programme because it links to the prior item and is key to ensuring sustainability into the medium term. And we'll also finally be focusing on key partners and how you are working with your subsidiaries to deliver appropriate services and proportionate governance, which we recognise is more challenging with third parties and subsidiaries. So that is a brief run through of opinion and VFM. The only other things I wanted to cover, Chair, was the timelines. So on 216, you've got our timelines. So for the opinion, we would be looking to issue our opinion for the November meeting of this committee. Given the increased work required for value for money this year, particularly given it's year 1, That has been recognised by MHCLG, and they have given auditors an extra 3 months from the time of the opinion audit. So if we do the opinion by the end of November, which we are aiming to do, that would be the end of February 2022 that we would issue the VFM work findings. Suffice to say that we will do all we can to see if we can bring that date forward. The only other thing I wanted to cover in relation to the plan is the fees, and I'm conscious that there were discussions on this previously. So we have some provisional fees for the 2021 audit. You'll notice there are some sizable increases against the scale fee, and those have been those reflect some of the additional work that's been undertaken last year that will roll forward into this year. But it also does reflect some increases in relation to the value for money work that, as I said, is more involved, but also the requirement for greater degrees of challenge as a result of a number of new accounting standards, including the ISO 541 in relation to estimates. So, Chair, before I go on to the progress report, I'm minded to stop there, but happy to take any questions on the plan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barber. Members, do you have any questions? Councillor Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just a quick question on the audit fees section. It talks about obviously the audit fee for the BCP Council audit and the audit of subsidiary charities. It quotes £37,000 for the audit of subsidiary charities. I think it lists 3 charities: the Russell Coates and the Parks, etc. In terms of your audit of those charities, is that to audit their accounts for submission to the Charity Commission, and etc., or do they, as a charity, have to do their own audit of their own accounts, or what you do is that basically sorts out their sort of finances and accounts for them?
Councillor Brown, you're absolutely right. It is for submission to the Charities Commission. It is for that purpose. So those are independent of the audits that we do for BCP, and those subsidiaries are able to go out and appoint their own external auditor as they see appropriate. It so happens that they've appointed us, and obviously that has some benefits in terms of the work that we do on the main BCP audit.
Just my only follow-up comment on that, just seems quite a lot, actually. 37,000 to audit the accounts of 3 charities seemed a lot from my experience, except they're probably fairly substantial sized charities. But I guess if they've chosen to go with you to do their audit work, then they've obviously done their own work to look at how much it should cost.
I'm not sure, Mr. Barber, what the comparable for that figure is for previous years. Could you help us?
I don't, Chair, off the top of my head. I could put Sam Harding on the spot. Sam, I don't suppose you're able to elaborate, given your sort of longer standing on these audits than myself.
Yes, thanks, Pete. Thanks, Chair. The fee remains the same as it was last year. There was an increase in the 1920 audit, just to reflect it as more commercial terms. I think the reason that they are fairly high is they are quite complicated, and the reason that I think the council was quite keen that we continued to do them is because they don't have their own ledgers and they don't have their own bank accounts, so they're all very well integrated within the Bournemouth Council. So the way they're set up at the moment would make them quite difficult to audit. Elsewhere, you'd almost have to audit Bournemouth to be able to audit the charities because they come from that ledger. They also do have substantial asset bases as well, and as we've already spoken about, that is a significant risk around the audit, so they do require a fair amount of work to deal with that.
Is that helpful, Councillor Brown?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I'm involved in a few smaller charities, and it's substantially cheaper than that. But I take your point that actually their assets is probably different to a lot of charities in terms of obviously the parks have a lot of assets, and the Russell Coates has assets. So I guess the sort of auditing and valuing those sort of assets is a significant part of that work. So.
Not a question for you, Mr. Barber, but perhaps something for us to take away and look at is I think this committee would benefit from having the view of a senior officer, possibly in his absence, the head of finance around the level of fee, so that we have a better understanding of is that fair value for BCP Council as the client, and that is something which I suspect we'd all benefit from knowing, given that the figures are here in the report, and effectively through the recommendation, if we're not asking the right questions, then we won't know the right answers either. And I wonder whether, when Mr. Richards returns, Mr. Stannard, whether you could pop him a note to ask him if he could do that for us, and if not he, then the most appropriate officer within the council, because I think without that we simply just don't know, do we? Nobody else has indicated questions, so back to you, Mr. Barber.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll move on to the progress report that starts on page 225. So this is a report that we bring to each meeting of this committee, and it essentially sets out the progress against the current year's audit, and it also provides some sector updates that may be of interest to members of this committee. I'm conscious some elements of this progress report have already been covered in the previous item. In terms of progress, overall, we are where we want to be at this stage of the audit, given the timing of the start. In terms of the opinion, obviously we've completed the planning to inform the plan. We've also now completed our interim work ahead of receiving the accounts. Your officers have now provided us with the draft accounts for 2021, and we're due to start our detailed post-statements visit in early August. I think it's a week and a half's time. And obviously, in terms of our audit approach, it is a substantive one. We don't place any significant reliance on controls. We are substantive. We test the detailed numbers in the accounts, and as I said, that's going to start in the next week or two. And we will be aiming to report our findings back, as I said, on the opinion by the end of November. Clearly, the accounts are very involved, complex. And one of the things that we have done this year, also we have done as a firm in previous years, is a series of workshops to support finance officers. Obviously, that was done remotely this year, and we held those in February. Pleased to be able to report that there was representation from BCP at those events where we discussed common issues arising last year, but also emerging issues for the current year. And in terms of VFM, as I said, the target is slightly later, and that is the core responsibilities of us. You'll also see in the report that we make reference to various certification and claims work that we do in various areas. Those summarised in the progress report refer to the previous years. That work is done at a later stage on a case-by-case basis, and is a work that is prescribed by the paying central government body. So, Chair, I wasn't going to say anything else on progress. And in terms of the sector update, there is a number of items there. I wasn't minded to go through those, but clearly I'm happy to take any questions on progress or the sector update.
Thank you, Mr. Barber. Members, do you have any questions? No, I think that's been most comprehensive, Mr. Barber, and appreciated. So there are no questions from members of the committee. That'll take us to the recommendations, both of which are for noting, and they are firstly that the Audit and Governance Committee notes the Grant Thornton External Audit Plan 2020-21 for the Council, and secondly that the committee notes the external auditor's progress to date in delivering their responsibilities and the sector update provided. So, members, are we supportive of noting those two recommendations?
Chairman, that's agreed.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barber and Ms. Harding. And I hope you found this evening's meeting, whilst you've been waiting, has demonstrated, the seriousness with which this committee takes its responsibilities and the challenges it then puts back out to officers in particular. Thank you for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at our next quarterly meeting, I suspect on the 28th of October 2021. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Members, that takes us to the final item on the agenda. I know we've slightly overrun, but that I think was inevitable with the length of the agenda. And item 17 is the Audit and Governance Committee forward plan. I think I would just want to speak about one item on here, and then I will hand over to Mr. Stannard. And the one item is our next meeting on the 9th of September, which is one of the additional meetings. For members who haven't been on Audit and Governance, I introduced additional meetings over and above the quarterly meetings to deal with specific business that Audit and Governance felt was pertinent to its role and its remit, and was timely as far as the Council was concerned. And much of that has come from suggestions from members of this committee. And those are then analysed as to whether, in fact, they are governance issues that need to be looked at. And one such is on this next additional meeting on the 9th of September, which is a review of BH Live contractual and governance arrangements. We actually, the Vice Chairman and I are on a meeting tomorrow morning, which is around the scoping of the report that officers are currently undertaking for that meeting. And the reason that we're on that call is because we want to make absolutely certain that when that comes to us as a substantial item for that meeting, that it actually covers all the governance areas that we would no doubt want it to do, rather than those that are being suggested to us exclusively. So we'll have a good look at that, and we'll see whether we want to broaden that and whether it's likely to be fit for purpose for such an important meeting. So that we're doing tomorrow, and that comes forward on the 9th of September as I think the only item on the agenda. So we'll do our best for you in preparation for it. So, Mr. Stannard, other items on the draft forward plan for 21-22?
Thank you, Chairman. So just a couple of things to point out. The very top line, Statement of Accounts 2021, just heard from Peter that we've got it down as the 28th of October at the moment. There is a chance that that will need to slip to the 2nd of December. So we'll keep that on flexible. You'll see about halfway down that we've added the regulation of investigatory powers policy to the annual evolution list. So that will come in March 22 with the whistleblowing, anti-fraud and declarations of interest policy evolutions that we currently do. And then finally, Chair, at the last meeting on the 10th of June, we had the review of parks governance, and you asked the monitoring officer to perhaps come back to the committee with a report about governance arrangements in a bit more detail. Currently, my team and Susan's team are pulling the work together for that report. So we just need to agree with you, Chair, whether we can squeeze that in on the 9th of September or some other subsequent date. Thank you.
What would be your recommendation then, Mr. Stannard? Do you think that we would be... I always like to make sure that we've allowed sufficient time for all items that are on the agenda, because they're all important.
Yeah, I think that's my concern, Chair, because I think the work we need to do, to a bit like the BH Live one, to make sure it hits the right buttons.
Indeed.
We might need to perhaps have it on the 28th of October and not the 9th of September.
Yes. Members, would you be in agreement with that proposal? I think, Mr. Stannard and indeed the other officers concerned understand, that we want to make sure we've got sufficient time for all items, that we're not squashing things in and then running out of time and not giving proper time to the other items on the agenda. Councillor Phipps.
Thank you. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the things I was going to raise that was not on there. And obviously it was an item as well. It was raised in agenda item 14 as well. So it's quite a big thing with the park trust arrangements and the charities and trusts. So I think we do need to make sure we've got enough time to look at this. Yeah. Following our last meeting, I submitted a whole range of questions, and it took quite a while, but I did get Susan actually sent me a lot of stuff back and a lot of answers. I don't know whether you were included in that, Chairman, in all the responses, but there is quite a lot of issues, I think, relating to these parks, and I think we do need to definitely give sufficient time to it. Thank you.
I'd certainly concur with that. So could we go along those lines, Mr. Stannard?
Thank you for that, Steer Chair. I'll put it on the forward plan for the 28th of October.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Any other issues on the forward plan? Don't let me stifle other suggestions coming forward in between meetings. If something occurs to you, please write and copy Mr. Stannard, and we'll then be able to consider whether it's got a profile that's suitable for A&G, and if it has, then try to put it into a future date on the forward plan. Are we happy, therefore, to follow the recommendation, which is that the committee approves the forward plan as set out at Appendix A, subject to the amendment that we've just discussed? All agreed to that? Excellent.
Unanimous, Chairman.
That brings us to the end of the agenda, and I therefore close the meeting at 8:32. Thank you.